Postmodernism is the secular face of the modern left. As with every video in the Agenda Explained series, I aim to break down one agenda and build up a tapestry of a wider agenda at play. Some people call this wider agenda globalism, but this doesn't fully explain it at its most fundamental level. For the purpose of this video, I'll be talking about postmodernism. Remember that this series doesn't aim to provide evidence and sources. It explains an agenda in as clear and concise a way as possible, allowing people to do further research if they so choose, either through other videos I've uploaded or elsewhere. So let's begin. As the word suggests, postmodernism is something that took place after modernism, although this can get very confusing because in many ways the rot of postmodernism began during modernism. Ironically, postmodernism is a reactionary movement in the true sense of the word. It's ironic because this movement is overwhelmingly made up of social and political radicals that like to accuse their detractors of reacting to them as though they're the ones that control and define Western culture and anyone else is just reacting to their long march through history. But this is an inversion of the truth by half-baked bohemians and pseudo-intellectuals who provide an outlet for denials that cross the line into pure mental illness. The very fact that postmodernism took place after modernism is itself an indication of being reactionary. The question is, what were the postmodernists, and indeed many of the modernists, reacting to? The answer is rationalists, empiricists, and classical liberals who laid the foundation for the Enlightenment that took hold in the 18th century. That said, as with any epoch in history, there are things that led up to this, and the Enlightenment is no different. What's important to understand is that the Enlightenment represented three key principles: individualism, rationalism, and empiricism. Postmodernists have systematically worked towards utterly destroying these principles and completely replacing them with a direct inversion of what they stand for. This started almost immediately after the 18th century Enlightenment, as some people reacted negatively to a very new way of looking at the world. There was no single movement that encapsulated this early on. It was made up of a combination of feudalists, monarchists, and spiritual thinkers who were later joined by radicals that led to what we would now call socialism, communism, or fascism. All groups had their own reasons for trying to destroy the principles of the Enlightenment. The reasons to undermine the Enlightenment are many, and to make this easier to understand, people need a basic grasp of the aforementioned Enlightenment principles. First is individualism. Throughout European history, there's been a push towards ever greater freedom of the individual from authority. This led to natural rights by reasoning that some actions lead to slavery and others lead to freedom. One philosopher that had a great deal to do with this was John Locke, the father of classical liberalism. Second is rationalism. René Descartes is referred to by many as the father of rationalism. Rationalists don't base their conclusions on testing their theories through research. Instead, they rely on reason alone. This has been going on since ancient Greece, but the Enlightenment led to new challenges to established dogma, even if this threatened old systems of knowledge, wisdom, and power. Third is empiricism. Empiricism is basically what we now call science, and Francis Bacon is considered the father of this school of thought. Interestingly, a historical conflict exists between rationalism and empiricism because, unlike rationalism, empiricism relies on evidence gathered through research. The conflict exists because empiricists are prone to arguing that only research can lead to sound conclusions. This is spurious because we can draw many reliable conclusions without research, like all birds have wings and beaks. There may well be some species of birds without wings and beaks, but this conclusion is still reliable enough to be a helpful understanding of the world. Locke, Descartes and Bacon were all thinkers that laid the foundation for what became known as the Enlightenment in the 18th century, although all of them lived before this time. This just goes to show that epochs in history are a build-up rather than something that takes place in some immediate time and place. Now that we have a basic understanding of what the Enlightenment stood for, it will be much easier to explain the reactionary nature of postmodernism. The people that laid the foundation for what we now call postmodernism have always tried to turn the principles of the Enlightenment against it by suggesting that they promote freedom while rationally and empirically arriving at their conclusions. While initially this anti-Enlightenment reaction was driven by the preservation of the church and monarchy, it gradually morphed into something far more nihilistic. Let's contrast this anti-Enlightenment with the Enlightenment. Anti-Enlightenment promoted collectivism and subjectivity over Enlightenment individualism, rationalism and empiricism. The father of the collectivist side of the anti-Enlightenment was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Frenchman that literally argued for the inverse of Locke, where collectives rather than individuals have rights. As well as the push for collectivism over individualism, there were a whole series of thinkers that attacked the rational and empirical side of the Enlightenment. One thinker set this into motion, Immanuel Kant. Kant's admirers typically argue that it's inaccurate or unfair to associate him with the anti-Enlightenment, but Kant was the father of a German philosophical movement called idealism, and without this, it's difficult to imagine any anti-Enlightenment taking place. Idealism is the belief that reality as we know it is impossible to truly understand and is therefore a subjective manifestation of our minds. Due to being incapable of explaining reality in any meaningful or accurate sense, some go as far as arguing that it's pointless to even try. In the case of Kant, he argued that there's a noumenal realm that can never be understood. This contrasts with what Kant called the phenomenal realm, which can be explained through human knowledge. It's not hard to see how this directly contradicts Enlightenment rationalism and empiricism. It would be a gross oversimplification to suggest that this is the full extent of anti-Enlightenment thought, but in a video of this length, it will have to do. What's important to understand is that it was anti-Enlightenment thinking that led to postmodernism. It would cause the deconstruction of reality and aesthetics to the point where it's not only unacceptable to objectively define existence, but that it's fruitless to even try. What sort of people would promote such a thing? Once this is clear, we can see what the postmodernism agenda is really all about. Human progress has always been held back by those that can't stand losing power and influence. To make this less likely, people try to keep the population gullible and servile. A special class of people then present themselves as the gatekeepers of knowledge and power. In the past, these were mystics, priests, kings, monarchs, aristocrats, and other titles given to those that claim to possess wisdom that can't be acquired by common people, or those that give themselves special status that grants them absolute authority over the masses. Once the Enlightenment took place, it became much harder to maintain this con, so new ways to perpetuate gullible and servile people had to be devised. Enter postmodernism, which deconstructs all knowledge to the level of absurdity, allowing for a new system of authority to save us from postmodern doubt and slavery. As ever, these systems are controlled by the same parasitical elites found in history, who've now refined their tactics for a more rational, scientific and secular age. How tragic it is that, despite the progress of the Enlightenment, we're still being controlled by the same old ancient tactics that kept humanity enslaved for thousands of years. This is Rocking Mystery, over and out.